Welcome to Accelerated. I'm your host, Vitaly Golomb. On this second season of the podcast, we're hearing from some of the global leaders in everything electric and autonomous, moving us quickly into the future. On this episode, we speak to Stefan Krause. Born to German parents in Colombia, he started his career at BMW in Germany and US, where he rose to become the youngest CFO and board member in the company's history. There, he also served as chairman of Rolls Royce. He was responsible for the relaunch of the Mini brand and was the original initiator of the BMW i electric vehicle program. He then served as the CFO of Deutsche Bank through the tough financial crisis years, and later as an advisor to Warburg Pincus and on the board of Rocket Internet. He moved to California to serve first as the CFO and COO of the EV startup Faraday Future before starting the pioneering and now publicly traded EV company Canoo. Oh yeah, somewhere in between, he found time to serve as the chairman of the Cosmopolitan Hotel in Las Vegas. Wow, what a career. Now, we talked about his beginnings in the industry, thoughts on the EV newcomers versus the automotive titans, autonomy, SPACs, and how he would have thrown it all away to become an entrepreneur earlier. Here's our conversation with Stefan. Stefan, thank you very much for being on Accelerated. Where do we find you today?
Yeah, I'm in Switzerland. And thank you for having me and inviting me to this.
Glad to have you, and it's an honor. So why don't we start at the beginning? How did you start your career in the auto industry?
Well, that's interesting. Probably I have to say there's something quite different and unexpected, because I started my auto industry being the son of the Volkswagen importer in Colombia. So my family's business was actually in the auto business, and I remember my dad left Germany and became an entrepreneur in Colombia by importing Volkswagen. So cars have been a part of my life since the early ages. Yeah.
So one thing led to another. You started your career and you became one of the youngest, if not the youngest, executive at BMW. Tell us a little bit about that story.
Yeah, and then obviously after finishing my study, trying to find out what I should do with my life, I joined BMW and started a career at BMW of about 20 years. Was there really started in the engineering department, putting together price lists, and this was not the time where everybody had a computer, where we still worked with green screens, and developed my career, and ended up for the last 8 years at BMW being the CFO of BMW, the Global CFO of BMW. I was moved into this position when I was 38, 39 years old. And at that time, I truly was the youngest board member in Germany.
So you famously started the BMW i program at BMW, the EV program. Tell us a little bit how that was born, and what were the discussions like around the boardroom?
Yeah, we were obviously BMW had, as you know, acquired the Rover Group, and had quite a difficult time with it, and decided to separate. And I became actually board member after the separation had happened from the Rover Group. We sold Land Rover to Ford, and we kept Mini, and the company needed to have some refocusing and some realignment. So I was a member of the board. I was also in charge partially of the company's strategy. So I had taken a strategy process that I had gotten to know in the US during my times in the US, and applied it to BMW. It's quite an onerous process, because it's not like a consultant comes in and works out and gives you a glossy piece of paper and with a strategy on it, because it really forces the top management team, which in this case was the board of BMW, to sit together and think together about envisioning how the company and what the challenges for the company could be in the future. And I led this process. We actually met as a board over about 6 weekends in a retreat in the Alps that BMW owned. And in many of preparations and discussions about, obviously, initially sharing how we believe the future will look like, we had a decision also to make whether to acquire another European combustion engine company, which was one of the options, and the other option was to really create an electric city car, believing that the future would be electric. And in that realm, we decided to go with a city car and develop a city car, because our belief was that more and more large cities and mega cities across the world were starting to exist, and that the mobility in these cities needed to be more sustainable. And that's why I convinced my fellow board members to start the Project I, like we called it, which then turned out at a later stage to also bring the BMW i8 and the BMW i3 to market.
What year was this program?
2000. This was in 2007.
What year was this program started?
2007.
Very good. So it was already in context where there was EVs were no secret. Tesla was quite far along in the process.
Yeah.
What was the calculation and kind of what does it take for a legacy brand like that? Famously, Germans are not. They're not just jumping on the next thing.
No.
It's there's usually some thought about it.
Yes.
What was the discussion? And maybe you can give us some insights.
Well, it's a long time ago, but first of all, you say that Tesla was underway with the Roadster at that time, right? With the first Roadster and with the Lotus-based Roadster. And to be honest, our engineers, BMW, were still convinced that electric is not the way to go. And there was a very firm conviction that maybe at some point, you could maybe leave your neighborhood in order not to wake up your neighbors with an electric drive. But for any long distance, you would need a combustion engine. And from today's perspective, it's unimaginable. But there was a belief that electric is not going to work, not for long distance driving, and therefore, obviously, for a brand like BMW, was not a real option. So in that sense, it was quite a bold move. But obviously, we went with a hybrid, which also expresses a little bit the insecurity. The i3 was not at the end of the day a full electric vehicle. Before that, BMW had developed an electric vehicle called the E2, which also was a small electric vehicle. So there was some experimenting around electric vehicles before the Project I as well. But that really never, led to a production car. It was experimental. It was, testing the technology. And the decision was made that we wanted to go into small cars was not something BMW was into. We liked larger cars, and we liked, powerful combustion engine, sporty cars that will go with the brand and will fit the brand. And at that time, obviously, the decision was only made. We needed to reduce our carbon footprint by the rules that were set out for the auto industry. And looking at the fact that we wanted to continue to sell 12-cylinder and 8-cylinder combustion engines and large diesel engines, we needed to have something to balance. And that was, to be honest, the big driver of deciding to build a small car brand with a hybrid engine to kind of get to the average, fleet consumption. And that was the driver at that time. It wasn't necessarily, a visionary view. It was just some math that, we had to implement to make sure that the company wouldn't have to pay substantial fines down the road by achieving its fleet emissions target.
So government regulations, of course, pushed BMW into this direction.
Yes. And then certainly California was always a concern. California was a large market for BMW. As a state, it's part of the US, but many, many years, California was the 5th largest market for BMW. Just the state of California was an important market. And obviously also legislation there, was pushing for zero emission vehicles and having a share in zero emission vehicles. So it definitely regulation was an important aspect of that decision.
And then you decided to jump out of a very well-established corporate career at some point and move to California and start, and you got attracted to Faraday. So you've shared a little bit of that story with me before. I would love for you to talk a little bit about how that came about and what made it so special that you decided to change careers, essentially.
Well, I had left Deutsche Bank after also 8 years being the CFO at Deutsche Bank during the crisis years, which obviously were quite interesting. So I actually had a total of 15 years being a member of a German DAX company, mostly I was CFO. I also had some other roles at BMW. I also did sales and marketing, and Deutsche Bank. I also led the transaction bank and the bad bank for a while as board member. But I had been in this routine of a CFO, quarterly reports and AGMs and all this regular agenda that you have to do. And I honestly was a little bit tired of it. So I decided not to go back to do the same for another 20 years that I still had ahead of me in terms of working. I went to London for a little bit, worked for Warburg Pincus, the private equity firm, and was trying to figure out what to do next. And to be honest, I got through a headhunter, I got the offer to join Faraday Future. And I took the time to look at the opportunity because auto industry was still appealing to me. And I visited the company, and I visited with the management team back then, and I was convinced there was a visionary idea, and there was an excellent team of people that was put together, and some good technology developed, and that intrigued me. So I decided to move to California and start working with Faraday.
And I mean, Faraday, famously the financing dried up. Maybe you can share a little bit about kind of the quick shift you then made to Canoo, and kind of what happened with Faraday in your eyes.
Well, and I think like, and I don't think it's so different. Many of the startups at that time across the board, had difficulties in finding funds. What we see in the last year wasn't yet the case that the capital markets had discovered electric mobility as the next big thing. I think all of these companies, we really had to fight for funding. Yeah, and especially in the car industry, as you know, Vitaly from your daily, it's just a lot of money. You need to build a car, and you need to develop a factory and develop a sales and service organization. It's just a huge investment, right? And it's very atypical because generally, you have these tech startups in California, and they'll find with 20 or 80 million, and they can build a business model. But in a car company, you're in for $1 billion plus, right? And that's just a lot of money to invest into a startup. So the method used back then is that you would go through several funding rounds, right? And the problem was always that on every one of these funding rounds, sometimes you got stuck. Yeah, you didn't get the money, and then your entire management team ended up in fundraising and due diligences instead of working on product and customers and factories and developing the project. And that was the same, obviously, for Faraday. It was a challenge to find funding at a certain point of time. Later on, all of a sudden, there was a lot of funding, and then it went back to not having funding. But this is not dissimilar from what happened to Lucid in the early days. Went through the same routine. And to be honest, we know from Tesla that for a long period of time was similar. So I think that's what happened to Faraday. Got stuck, and I decided to move on and decided to form an own electric car company with Canoo.
Now, Canoo is quite a different vision originally than just another EV. So maybe you can talk a little bit about the original vision of Canoo.
Yeah, we were a group of people that had gone through a couple of the startup, had really good sense for the EV industry, and at that point in time. And as we started in December of 2017, there was so many startups, many years ahead of us, right? They had developed product already, and we started. So it was clear to us that to do something that, well, like everybody, most of these companies at that point in time were trying to be Tesla killers, right? There was kind of the most generally, Lucid was trying to do this, Faraday was trying to do this, and many others, and they all were just trying to be the better, faster, bigger, more expensive, or more performant Tesla, right? So that was kind of what these companies were doing. And when we sat together to kind of think about what we should do with Canoo, it was clear to us that would not score anymore, right? That there were enough companies trying to be just Tesla killers. So we did an analysis of what the world really needed, and we started to think about also what the big advantage of electric drivetrains are. And the interesting part for us was that nobody was really redesigning the vehicles based on the fact that the architecture of the vehicle in electric is different than the architecture of a combustion engine vehicle. And I remember we had these charts where we showed that at the end, a combustion engine car is today still designed in what we call the three-box design. Yeah, that comes from the horse carriages. You know, in a horse carriage, you had the engine, which are the horses in the front, and then you had the passenger box in the middle, and then you had the luggage compartment in the back. And you think about most of the combustion engine cars were designed the same way, yeah, because we replaced the horse with an engine and we kept the passenger cabin, and then we generally have a trunk in the back. And that over 100 years in vehicle development and design, that principle stayed. And it was so interesting to us to see that, the first electric vehicles like you see on a Tesla Model 90 didn't rethink the architecture of the vehicle, but just had a frunk, yeah, because there was no engine anymore, a hole in the front and a hole in the back. And if people use their trunks in 1% of the time they own their car. So this is wasted space. And on the other hand, we saw that people are buying ever bigger SUVs, so there was clearly a need for space. And we very strongly felt that this was the big advantage of electric drivetrain. If we would be able to build a very flat floor skateboard, put in a steer-by-wire system so we can put the steering wheel anywhere we wanted, we could build a vehicle that from the outside was quite small, but from the inside offered the same space than a large SUV. And that was what said, that's different. And then, I was always a big fan of subscription. I think subscription in vehicles will work in the future. And then combine it with a business model that was also different. So we had these two pillars. You said, we're going to build a different vehicle from an architecture point of view. The first vehicle that really uses to its fullest extent the opportunity that an electric drivetrain offers. And then we'll create a business model that offers these vehicles in subscription, mainly to solve for the high acquisition price that electric vehicles usually have, and where too many people cannot afford electric vehicles and provide their contribution to the environment because the acquisition cost is so high, while it's obviously total cost of operating an electric vehicle is much lower than operating a combustion engine. So that was what the initial thought was. So our designers started to draw what this is. And you have to think about today in a combustion engine vehicle, if I were to take the whole space of a vehicle, about almost 60% of the vehicle, sometimes even 70% of the space of the vehicle is being used to stuff all these things, the technology in that you need. You have a big engine, you have a big gas tank, you have struts, you have all this. So if you think about how much space is wasted to put all these components into the vehicle, and then how we cram people, all the packaging, and how we cram people into a passenger cabin. So we wanted to solve that problem, and that's how we started the idea of Canoo.
And then Canoo is one of the companies that went out via SPAC. I want to come back to the SPACs question in a second here, but after the company got funded and went public, you left, and the company changed direction a little bit. What are your thoughts on kind of the new direction for the company?
I think that's always a prerogative of a new management team to take a different view and develop the new business. I once heard many, many years ago at Deutsche Bank, somebody made this joke as who are the two worst employees of a company? And the answer to that question is always it's your predecessor first, and then it's your successor after. And I always thought that statement had something true. So I started not to criticize nor my predecessors nor my successors in what they do. I think they'll have their good reasons to move the company to where they believe it will be successful, and at the end of the day, over time, we will see. Yeah, I'm personally I liked very much what we did at Canoo. It was very differentiated, but sometimes also was difficult because people that were not at the forefront, and didn't understand what subscription is and how it works because they didn't understand the math, or they didn't understand why electric cars will look different in the future. it was also sometimes difficult. So sometimes when you're at the forefront of developing something new, you might not find everybody applauding. So that's the downside. If you're a little bit less traditional, if you're more traditional, you get quicker applause. Yeah, but the question, that's what something we learned at BMW. Sometimes the hard way, if you get applause immediately, it may not last for very long, right? And
nobody's applauding the new grills at BMW.
Yeah, but you will see in a year or two from now, people are gonna like it, and that's something I learned at design of BMW. And I remember we had the BMW 8 Series, right? There was a car that immediately got applause. It looked really, really good, and it was dead after 2 years. After 2 years, it looked like an old car, right? So designers at BMW, Chris Bangley always taught me, and I kept this always in mind, a car needs to have an edge, and a design needs to be an edge, and there needs to be an eye catcher, and it's totally okay at the beginning you don't like it at all, right? Because your eyes, and if you transfer, to be honest, if you look, I don't know, I'm sure you have some pictures from the 90s, how you dressed, and from the 80s, how people dressed in the 70s. You know, they were convinced that this was nice and beautiful, and we look at it today and it's horrible, right? And I know from my daughters, you know, sometimes when a new fashion comes around, like completely ripped off jeans, the first reaction is, oh my God, I'm going to wear this. And 2 months later, everybody's running around with it, right? So there you see that the human eye, you know, wants to see something different. And this different that first is perceived as being ugly very quickly gets adopted and then becomes the fashion, right? And that's the same with car design, right? And therefore, you know,
we'll see what happens with the Cybertruck over time.
That was a good.
I personally still think it's a
but you will see. You will see
quite an awkward
design. But you will see, and I'm pretty sure that and you see the first designers taking ideas and cues from this type of a design. And it's gonna move, you know, car design in a different direction. So I like that. I think it was a bold move, and it's certainly a different vehicle. And when you drive around this in the usual traffic, because to be honest, most cars look alike today, right? So they're all done in images. So there's not. I always laugh. That's why I like to collect old cars, because each one of these cars still had character and had design. And obviously today, at the end of the day, most of the cars look the same, right? So
I think all the homologation standards are really controlling the envelope of design. Not to get too deep into that rabbit hole, but speaking of BMW designers, you also helped Henrik Fisker take Fisker through the SPAC process as well. You know, EVs are not a secret anymore. I remember when I was working with Rimac a few years back out of Croatia, Rimac Automobili. It was very difficult fundraise, you know, just 4 or 5 years ago that we went through, and nobody would touch EVs. But now EVs are the worst kept secret and really, really hot space. What do you think? You know, we talked about this briefly before as well, but I thought your point was very interesting. Who do you think will succeed? Do you think startups have a better chance of succeeding and building new car brands, or do you think the legacy auto brands will ultimately win the marathon because they have the strength in manufacturing, supply chains, and kind of brand recognition? What are your thoughts, kind of in that race between new brands and traditional brands?
Yeah. So obviously, and that's so this is first a very good question, and we've obviously have been asked this question very often. I'm personally siding on the new entrants. I think the new entrants will win this battle, and the so far, with a very few exceptions, you see how the big manufacturers are really struggling to move into EV, because normally you should have said after Tesla's success, that now is at least 4 or 5 years old, right? That all these companies should have woken up and started to move into electric faster. You know, they don't have the fundraising problem. They don't have the resource problem. They don't have to build factories, right? They have everything at their hands, and they could have moved. And you see how important, how interesting it is. These companies have learned to be competitive in combustion engine technology. They're They know that they differentiate themselves through 3 and 6 and 8 and 12 cylinder engines and gearboxes with 7 gears and drivetrains that are quite complicated to keep a combustion engine vehicle on the road. And at the end of the day, powertrain dominance was something very important in the past competition. It's not important anymore. And what's important is obviously, for example, your software competence to do over-the-air updates on your vehicles, right? These companies can't do it. They don't have the people to do it. They don't have the culture to do it. IT people in car manufacturers are always treated like citizens of second class, right? Because the true people in the company, they're engineers and they develop vehicles, right? And therefore these companies,
mechanical engineers,
they're mechanical engineers, right? And therefore, obviously, they don't get the right people, right? They don't get the talented people to help them evolve their software platform. And some of them have so much money, they hire then 2,000 people, and these 2,000 people produce less software than, in California, a focus group of 50, yeah? And it's for me. So for me, it's pretty clear. I don't think culturally most of these companies will do the shift, number one, right? I think they're all struggling. I see how CEOs that are trying to move in Germany their companies into electric still get criticized, right? I see how, for example, obviously because they're still selling lots of combustion engine vehicles, they continue to develop combustion engine vehicles. So I think on the culture front and on the technology front, they will lose the battle against the much quicker moving, and nimble small players. We at the end at Canoo had at the peak about 350 engineers and designers and people in the company. We could develop a full car. At BMW, I remember, we had thousands of people in order to develop a car. And, the cost was a couple of $100 million at Canoo. And to develop a 3 Series at BMW was in the billions, right? So it just I don't think they'll get accustomed to nimbly. And the future competition is certainly still around design, but it's around connectivity, and the drivetrain won't matter because all the electric drivetrains are fast. The batteries are always heavy and at the bottom, so these cars won't turn over. You don't need this, expensive drivetrain technology to keep the car on the road. So that their competitive strengths just don't matter anymore, right? And they're not realizing that that's the big change. It's not about just plugging in an electric. It's not better. And then last but not least, where I believe the final killer will come, all these companies, these OEMs are leasing lots of combustion engine vehicles. And then you will see in 5 to 6 years, when consumers don't buy combustion engine vehicles, and when the residual value losses in these companies will be huge.
Interesting, because they have these leases, combustion.
Every day today,
leases on the balance sheet.
Every day today, all these companies are putting out cars on leases, and they will come back in 3 to 5 years and will be worth nothing, right? Because there will be no buyers for used combustion engine vehicles, in my mind. And therefore the truth is, at the end of the day, if you ask me, and that's always a question to finally answer your question. So if you give me $100 and tell me I should invest $100 in a pure play electric company, or invest the same $100 in a large OEM, I know that 70 of my $100 in the large OEM have to be used for losses to get rid of the combustion engine business and the legacy assets, legacy factories, legacy people, residual values. Whilst if I put my 100 in a pure play electric car company, 100 will go towards the future, right? And that's for me ultimately why I believe the big OEMs will not win this battle.
That's interesting. So to be devil's advocate, let's say perhaps the big players, the big legacy players, were waiting for the market to materialize, because you can argue that Tesla, as long as it's been around, almost 20 years now, they still have yet to really turn a profit from selling vehicles. All the profits that they've made are from selling credits to the old players. Now they're starting to turn over and not need to buy those credits, and selling Bitcoin or whatever else they're selling. So I guess that's one argument. The other is, it seems in year 21, 22 model year, we're seeing something like 30 EVs launch from everybody: GM, Ford, BMW, Mercedes, etc., along with the other players, Volkswagen, of course. Don't you think that they were just ready? They were trying to time it, and they're just being conservative and not willing to lose money while the market is not there yet, and they're just using Tesla as a kamikaze to build the market. What do you think about that angle?
I think to start with, the second problem with that thought process is combustion engine was about selling vehicles, and I do believe that as the world has evolved, the truth is nobody's really selling vehicles anymore. These vehicles are all going on monthly payments, and therefore subscription model and monthly payments. And the reason obviously is it doesn't matter what the manufacturers did. I think that we need to come also a different way on how we use these vehicles and how they're being, sold or brought into the market. That's why I was a big fan of subscription, because the problem, way too many people today look at the car purchase decision and look at the acquisition price only. Yeah, and that's why they're deterred to buy an electric vehicle, not understanding that over life the electric vehicle will be much less expensive to them than the combustion engine vehicle. So I think the problem is we need a more radical change in how we look at this changeover and what the skills are that you need to have to do this changeover. I know that many of these OEMs are bringing vehicles to the market. I ask you, how many of them can over the air update their software?
It's a good question. I think Mercedes announced that they are
planning to do it,
but we'll see.
But they're not there yet.
We'll see how it
goes. That's my point. So in my mind, the true innovation that Tesla brought, is they can update the software side. So obviously that makes with my understanding is that still, if I buy a VW, I have to go into the shop to get my software updated, right? And they have to put it onto a system and charge it, and many of these electric cars too. So this radical rethinking, that is not just, and that's exactly the problem that they're approaching. It's just stucking in an electric drivetrain into an existing vehicle and continue to sell them the same and service them the same and manufacture them the same. That's the problem, right? I think that it will be very important to understand that is a more radical change, and they're designing them the same, by the way. They still look like combustion engine vehicles, and I think that's the failure. And I always make some fun, and I encourage you and the listeners to do it. Just we had one changeover when we went from the horse, right? We went to the car, and if you read the fears and the approach, there's articles out why the horse will win, right? And when you read, right, when you approach a car with a horse thinking, then of course the horse will win. And I think that's exactly what's happening right now. If you approach this industry with a combustion engine thinking, right, then of course the combustion engine will win.
And ironically, those first horseless carriages were electric.
Yes, there was the other interesting part. The first ones were, or many of them were electric at the beginning. Yeah. So I think if you ask me where I would put my $100 investment into, I go pure play.
Interesting. I'm with you. I'm with you in part. I'm a big fan of certain car brands. I won't mention that are legacy and have some really interesting legacy, but certainly a big fan of new ones. So speaking of that, I think one of the key areas, especially when we're talking about consumer vehicles, a big part of the investment is building the brand. And it's not just engineering, it's making people fall in love and have this emotional, irrational reaction to a vehicle, right? And for me, I mean, I started working full time at 15 because I fell in love with cars and I wanted a nice car, or some not beater when I turned 16 and could drive in California. I don't know what it is these days. And my parents, they said, well, if you want a car, go get a job and you can buy yourself a car. And that's exactly what I did. But this irrational falling in love with vehicles and building a brand, there are lots of new ones out there. I think, for example, Rivian is doing a phenomenal job of building their brand and building a community and culture around their brand. What are some of your favorites that you think are doing it well? And what are they doing well?
Well, I think Tesla did an outstanding job. If I ask my 7-year-old what his favorite car brand is, he says Tesla. he doesn't say BMW anymore, Mercedes or something, or Porsche.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, he says Tesla, and I think you'll find that increasingly it's these new brands that are appealing to the young people, because we also didn't like to drive our parents' brands, and therefore there's also a brand transition, right? And these new brands tend to be younger brands and tend to cater to a younger audience as well, and that's going to be the big benefit. So I can say I think many are doing a job for Tesla first. You talked about Rivian. I do agree that they've made their name known, and obviously, and they've gone through quite a transition from originally being one type of a company and now moving a little bit into different, which always is a little bit of a challenge when you start a brand. But I think Lucid start doing a great job as well in creating a good brand that's a believable brand. So I think that there's a couple of good, and honestly in China, NIO did a super good exercise in creating a brand and creating a whole lifestyle around it. And yes, at the end of the day, you see these brands up and coming, and there will be a few ones that I also believe will be able to achieve the same.
When companies start to catch fire and blitzscale and look for capital to fuel that growth, or look to find the right exit strategy, they often seek the counsel of investment bankers. At Drakestar Partners, we work with some of the leading companies in global tech on capital raises, M&A, corporate carve-outs, SPACs, and much more. And we're pretty good at it. Our team of over 100 technology sector experts across 9 offices in 6 countries is comprised of not only career bankers, but experienced executive venture investors and technologists. Drakestar Partners is the #1 ranked and fastest growing mid-market investment bank across the US and Europe. While I focus on mobility and energy transition sector, along with all things Silicon Valley, my partners from the Pacific to the Atlantic and around the world lead in software, media, communications, and everything in between. Learn more about us at drakestar.com. Now, let's switch gears a little bit to autonomy. When do you think, from your experience, do you think true autonomy will be available, and what market segments are going to be the first?
So I firmly believe that highway traffic will be the first on longer distances. Because it's, honestly, all the systems we have today and I do it regularly, and this is, I've used Teslas and I've used BMWs and Mercedes automated autopilot systems, and they're already super good, right? So I think the step to just plug in the exit on the highway you want to exit and have the navigation system control, and because the highway driving is kind of a little bit boring and dumb, and if you drive over longer distances, why wouldn't we let the computers drive? Probably safer, we could increase safely the speed on highways, and I think you'll get people to buy into this quite rapidly. So if you ask me, based on where we stand today with autopilot systems, I think in 5 years, we could have dedicated lanes on highways for complete autonomous vehicles.
But these will be, I think what you're describing is level 3, right? These are vehicles that are capable of limited autonomy in certain areas.
No, I would talk full autonomy. I would talk that you can fully autonomy to drive, that you don't have the driver to focus anymore or interject. The vehicle might be still able to do both, but the vehicle itself in that mode will be drive fully autonomous. Today, obviously, the driver still needs to be attentive. The driver is still responsible.
So today it's like we call it kind of level 2.9, right? Level 2.9 autonomy, where it's to stay legal, within the constructs of legislation. But I mean, level 3 is you don't have to pay attention. But then what I mean is more level 5, right? That means no steering wheel, no controls for the vehicle.
Yeah. You move them away and the car drives by itself. That's how I would see a trend in 5 years could be, because the technology is there already and the cars could do it, right? And the second is what I've seen, obviously, retirement communities, for example, closed communities, they will also, in my mind, in 5 years, have autonomous mobility.
So kind of slow speed,
slower
speed and very limited.
But a controlled environment, you can have that in 5 years, and the technology is there. And then the most difficult will be inner city traffic. I think this is still a challenge.
That's going to be the last one to go. Yeah. Now, SPACs, we touched on this already a little bit, but I wanted to dig a little bit deeper because that's become a 4-letter word this year. SPACs were very hot in the EV space, starting from about mid-year 2020. There were a lot of high-profile projects that kind of accelerated and compressed their fundraising and became public companies. Assuming the audience knows a bit about the space, what do you think, now that the hype has receded, do you think the SPACs are here to stay? I mean, this is more for your CFO hat and a public company CFO. What do you think about SPACs and that vehicle, the financial vehicle, I should say, and is it here to stay?
I'm only to disclose it. I'm a big fan of SPACs. I think this is a great tool to use. I think it's because ultimately it's a great tool to really move humanity forward, because it does provide good ideas funding, right? It does provide sustainable ideas funding. So I think that's great news. And at the end of the day, it also allows investors that traditionally cannot participate in the value creation of new ideas, because generally that's open to private markets, but not to public markets. And sometimes the enormous value development that you could experience as a private investor, you can't as a public investor. And I think this for me, it's a great tool because it fulfills these two things. It will help the world progress faster, and it will enable more people to participate in the wealth creation that new technologies, new ideas generate. And that's why I think, will we have accidents? Of course we will have accidents. Every time we start something new, we first have accidents, and then we make the system safer. And I just had a discussion with the German newspaper, and I said to them the same. At the beginning of flying airplanes, we had a lot of accidents and we had a lot of casualties, but we didn't stop flying. We didn't take this. And that's why when people ask me now, should we abolish the SPACs again? I look at them and said, well, we didn't stop flying, and it was the right thing to do because of the benefits of flying. And that's the same with SPACs. We shouldn't stop SPACs. We should make the whole system safer. We should make sure that people don't take advantage of retail investors. And we should make sure that these companies comply with the rules of the game in public markets and understand them. And we should make sure that SPAC teams really go out to buy good companies and take this seriously and go through their due diligence, and instead of just flipping companies, right, and trying to make a quick buck. But I think this all we can manage as we improve the systems. But for me, SPACs are here to stay. They're an excellent vehicle to give both management teams enough funding to realize their projects and improve the world, and as I said, and also give more people the ability to participate in value creation.
It's interesting. I mean, if we kind of zoom out a little bit, we can see that the dot-com days and pre-Enron, it was a lot easier to take a company public in the U.S. But then we had the new SOX regulation, Sarbanes-Oxley, that made it much more difficult and much more costly and time-consuming for companies to go public. Where SPACs have existed for a long time for different purposes. And somewhere along the line, somebody realized that, hey, we can use these vehicles to essentially accelerate companies and get them public a lot earlier. So it seems like we're kind of going, back and forth. The pendulum is swinging back and forth, and it's interesting to see if we don't have any big crashes as you described it. Hopefully, these vehicles will stay, and there will be enough trust from the public market investors to make sure that this is a very viable alternative than doing a traditional IPO, which can take twice as long and cost a lot more for companies to go through. So I very much agree with you there. So I wanted to thank you for your time and close with one last question. Okay. Now, since I got into my 40s, I've been asking myself this. I learned a lot, and then I like to ask this question: is knowing what you know now, what advice would you give yourself? Graduating undergrad, let's say at 22, plus minus, when you were just starting your career. Knowing what you know now, what have you done differently or faster or haven't done maybe?
Well, maybe there's two things that occurred to me to answer your question. The first one, I would have probably gotten to be an entrepreneur sooner. I was happy to be an employee of large companies first. I learned a lot. I was fortunate enough that they also moved me through the ranks quite rapidly, and I could, experience and learn different things. So I experienced that. But maybe I should have done this a little bit shorter than, spent 20 years at BMW and then 8 years at Deutsche, 28 years in this. I should have probably moved to become an entrepreneur sooner. And of course, life was, the problem was that life was comfortable. You had a paycheck, you had not to worry about fundraising and things like that. So,
right.
And it was an interesting job, of course, in all cases. And therefore, that would be the one advice. The second advice, I to be honest, I very much underestimated the power of having a good network, right? And because that's not what you learn in business school necessarily. Yeah, you learn how to value, especially when you have a CFO career, everything is about numbers and concepts and theories. And obviously, I was also part of many of the management fads that turned over the years, and I was involved in process engineering and Six Sigma and all of these things that we like to do. But to be honest, and that's something I learned over the last, I would say, 8 years, is it's the power of your network that really defines you, and the people you have access, the people you have learned from. So what I definitely would do, honest, I used to be of the opinion that to spend a lot of time in cultivating your network and your relationships was a little bit of a waste of time, and I was do my job and work and I must say I should have struck sometimes a better balance between cultivating, developing, exploring and developing my network versus just doing work, right? And just focusing on getting stuff done. Yeah. So that's probably what the two answers I'll give you on your last question.
Maybe that's the difference between being a corporate finance expert and choosing that path versus being the number one sales guy as the CEO of a startup.
Exactly.
Stefan, I really appreciate your time. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to always talk to you always and work shoulder to shoulder with you on these exciting projects we're working on.
For sure.
So I really appreciate you being on with us and Accelerated.
No, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Great idea. Thanks for inviting me and having me. And good luck to everyone.
This was our conversation with Stefan Krause, former CFO of BMW and Deutsche Bank turned EV entrepreneur. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you did enjoy this episode, don't forget to give us 5 stars in your podcast app and share it with your friends. See you in the next one. And in the meantime, you can always find me at golomb.net.